Harlem, 1935. A woman in her 60s walked home from the market, grocery bag in hand, moving through the afternoon crowds on 135th Street. Her name was Margaret Johnson. She'd lived in Harlem for 40 years, raised her children there, buried her husband there. She knew every face on her block, every shopkeeper, every corner. She walked with the confidence of someone who belonged. But on this particular afternoon in August, that sense of safety was about to be shattered in a way that would set off a chain of events nobody could have predicted. Officer Patrick Sullivan spotted her from across the street. He was working the day shift, badge gleaming on his chest, nightstick hanging from his belt. Sullivan had a reputation in Harlem, and not the kind that inspired trust. For 3 years, he'd been shaking down local businesses, pocketing protection money, roughing up anyone who looked at him wrong. He was untouchable, or so he thought. The police department protected its own, even the corrupt ones, especially the corrupt ones. What happened next, witnesses would talk about for decades. Sullivan crossed the street, walked up behind Margaret Johnson, and without a word of warning shoved her hard from behind. She fell forward, groceries scattering across the sidewalk, her hands hitting the concrete hard enough to scrape skin off her palms. She was 63 years old. The street went quiet. People stopped mid-conversation. A fruit vendor froze with an apple in his hand. A group of children playing stickball turned to stare. Everyone on that block knew who Margaret Johnson was. More importantly, everyone knew who her son was. Sullivan stood over her, grinning. He said something under his breath that only Margaret could hear, something about knowing her place, about Harlem belonging to men like him now. Then he walked away, whistling, as if he'd just finished a pleasant afternoon stroll. Margaret pulled herself up slowly. Her hands were bleeding. Her knee had hit the pavement hard enough that she'd limped for a week. But the physical pain wasn't what hurt most. It was the humiliation, the public nature of it, the fact that it happened in broad daylight, in front of her neighbors, in front of children who'd grown up calling her Miss Margaret with respect. Sullivan had done more than hurt an old woman. He'd sent a message. Nobody in Harlem was safe, not even the mothers of legends. 2 hours later, word reached Bumpy Johnson. He was in a card game above Small's Paradise when a kid named Jerome burst through the door, breathless, barely able to get the words out. Bumpy didn't move immediately. He finished his hand. A full house. Aces over kings collected his winnings, stood up slowly, put on his hat, and walked out without saying a word. The men at the table knew what that silence meant. They'd seen it before. Someone had just made the last mistake of their life. See, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just another Harlem hustler. By 1935, he'd already built a reputation as someone who played chess while everyone else played checkers. He didn't start fights, he ended them. He didn't make threats, he made examples. And he had one rule that everyone in Harlem understood. You could challenge him, you could try to take his territory, you could even try to kill him. But you never, ever touched his family. Sullivan had just broken that rule. Bumpy spent the next 36 hours doing what he did best, planning. While other men would have stormed the precinct in rage, Bumpy understood something fundamental about power. Rage makes you predictable. Patience makes you dangerous. He needed to know Sullivan's routine, where he drank, where he lived, when he walked alone, who protected him. He needed to understand the man's weaknesses, his fears, his pressure points. Because this wasn't going to be about violence. This was going to be about justice. And justice, real justice, requires precision. Bumpy had connections everywhere. A bartender at O'Malley's pub, where the Irish cops drank after their shifts. A cleaning woman who worked at Sullivan's apartment building. A numbers runner who had been beaten by Sullivan 6 months ago and remembered every detail. Within 24 hours, Bumpy had a complete picture of Patrick Sullivan's life. His debts, his drinking problem, his mistress in Brooklyn, his gambling habit, his fear of the dark that he tried to hide behind bravado. Sullivan lived alone in a fourth-floor walk-up on the edge of Harlem, close enough to police territory that he felt safe, far enough from the precinct that he was vulnerable. He worked the day shift, but stayed out late drinking. He walked home alone, usually around 1 a.m., too drunk to notice if anyone was following him. And most importantly, he had a weakness that Bumpy could exploit. Sullivan's entire identity was wrapped up in that uniform, the badge, the authority, the power it gave him over people he considered beneath him. Take away the uniform, and what was left? Just a scared man who'd been bullying people to hide his own cowardice. August 19, 1935. 1:27 a.m. Sullivan stumbled out of O'Malley's pub, drunk on whiskey and his own sense of invincibility. The streets were empty, lit only by occasional street lamps casting yellow pools of light. He walked north toward his apartment, weaving slightly. He didn't notice the shadow that detached itself from an alley and began following him. He didn't hear the footsteps that matched his own pace, staying just far enough back to remain invisible. He didn't sense the danger until it was far too late. 3 blocks from his apartment, in a stretch of street between street lamps where the darkness was complete, Bumpy Johnson stepped out in front of him. Sullivan stopped. His hand went instinctively to his nightstick. His eyes, even through the drunken haze, widened with recognition. Everyone in Harlem knew Bumpy's face. But seeing him here, alone in the dark, was something else entirely. Bumpy's voice was quiet, almost conversational. "You touched my mother." Sullivan's hand tightened on the nightstick. His other hand moved toward his service revolver, but before he could reach it, 2 men materialized from the shadows behind him. Junie Bird and Charlie Lucas, 2 of Bumpy's most trusted associates. They weren't holding weapons. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze Sullivan in place. "I'm a police officer," Sullivan said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You can't." "You put your hands on a 63-year-old woman," Bumpy interrupted. His tone hadn't changed. He could have been discussing the weather, in front of children, in broad daylight. "You made her bleed on her own street." Sullivan tried to muster authority. "I'll have you arrested. I'll have all of you." "No," Bumpy said simply, "you won't." What happened next would become legend in Harlem, a story passed down through generations. Bumpy didn't beat Sullivan. He didn't hurt him physically at all. Instead, he did something far more devastating. He took away the only thing Sullivan valued: his identity as an untouchable authority figure. Junie Bird and Charlie Lucas grabbed Sullivan, not violently, but firmly, and stripped him of his uniform. The badge went first, torn from his chest and dropped in a puddle. Then the belt with the nightstick and gun. The shirt, the pants, the shoes, everything that marked him as a police officer, everything that gave him power, was removed piece by piece and thrown into the street. Sullivan stood there in his undershirt and shorts, sobbing, begging, promising he'd leave Harlem, promising he'd never come back, promising anything if they'd just stop. But Bumpy wasn't finished. He took Sullivan's service revolver, emptied the bullets onto the ground, and handed the empty gun back to him. Then he spoke, and his words carried a weight that would echo through Harlem for years. "You're going to walk to your precinct right now, in your underwear, crying, holding that empty gun, and you're going to tell them exactly what you did to my mother. You're going to confess to every shakedown, every beating, every dollar you stole. And if you don't," Bumpy leaned in close, "if you don't, I won't come after you. I'll let Harlem handle it. And Harlem doesn't forget." Sullivan walked through the dark streets, past late-night diners where people stared, past corner boys who laughed, past apartment windows where faces appeared to watch the spectacle. He walked for 45 minutes, sobbing uncontrollably, still wearing his undershirt and shorts, still clutching that empty revolver, completely broken. He reached the precinct at 2:31 a.m. The desk sergeant's face went white when Sullivan stumbled through the doors. Other officers rushed over, demanding to know what happened, who did this, trying to cover him with a blanket. And through his tears, Sullivan told them everything, not because he wanted to, but because he was too broken to lie anymore. The confession destroyed him. Within a week, Sullivan was dismissed from the force. The department tried to keep it quiet, but Harlem doesn't keep secrets. Word spread about the cop he'd beaten an old woman and paid for it by losing everything that defined him. Sullivan left New York entirely, disappeared into anonymity somewhere in Pennsylvania, and was never seen in Harlem again. Bumpy visited his mother the next afternoon. Her hands were still bandaged. She sat in her kitchen, drinking tea, surrounded by neighbors who'd come to check on her. When Bumpy walked in, the room went quiet. Margaret looked at her son for a long moment, then shook her head slightly. She didn't ask what he'd done. She didn't need to. The story was already everywhere. Violence isn't the answer, she said quietly. Bumpy knelt beside her chair, something he rarely did for anyone. I didn't touch him, Mama. I just showed him who he really was. Margaret studied his face, then nodded slowly. Because she understood, even if she wished it could have been different. In Harlem, in 1935, justice wasn't something you got from the system. It was something you took. And her son had just demonstrated that power didn't come from a badge or a uniform or the color of your skin. It came from respect, from community, from knowing that some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. The story became legend. Old-timers still tell it decades later. They talk about the night Bumpy Johnson made a corrupt cop walk through Harlem in his underwear, crying, broken, stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. They talk about how justice came not through courts or official channels, but through one man's calculated patience and understanding of what truly breaks a bully. Not pain, but humiliation. Not violence, but exposure. And they talk about the lesson it taught. That real power isn't about uniforms or badges or authority granted by institutions. It's about respect earned through action. It's about protecting your community, your family, your people. It's about understanding that sometimes the most devastating response isn't a fist. It's a mirror held up to show a man exactly what he's become. So what would you have done if someone had hurt your mother in broad daylight, banking on the fact that the system would protect them? What would your response have been? Would you have called the authorities who protected the corrupt cop in the first place? Would you have sought legal justice in a system built to fail you? Or would you have understood, as Bumpy did, that sometimes justice has to be taken, not asked for? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from Harlem's legendary past. And remember, respect isn't given by institutions. It's earned through actions. It's defended through courage, and it's never forgotten by the communities that witness it.